this as the moment maybe when Hitler loses the Second World War?
At the very least, he could have bought himself one extra year.
If the Soviets had attacked in strength around December 1941, you've got a totally different story.
Had Pearl Harbour happened, say, a week later, by which time Hitler may have known a lot more about the Russian winter offensive, he would have made a very different decision when it comes to declaring war on the US.
My money is on a clear yes.
Could Britain and the Soviet Union have continued? I think yes.
If you'd asked Adolf Hitler on the morning of December 11th, 1941, "Sir, do you really want to drag another great power into this war? What about the crisis?" He would have said, "Crises? What crises?" There's absolutely nothing in the Lend-Lease law that rules out weapons of mass destruction.
So you could have a scenario in which the bomb is dropped on Berlin?
Yeah.
It's the 11th of December 1941, just 4 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbour that saw the US officially enter the Second World War in retaliation. This was only between the US and Japan. That was until Adolf Hitler made a call that has been theorised and questioned by historians ever since. The decision to support its ally in the East and for Germany to declare war on the US, thus bringing America into Europe and the global conflict. Why did Hitler do this? Was it a choice that he needed to make? And if he hadn't, would the rest of the Second World War have played out very differently indeed? James Hanson, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every episode we focus on a different military campaign or tide of history, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. This episode is sponsored by Visit Malta. Right in the heart of the Mediterranean, Malta is a blend of history, culture, nature and hospitality. To find out how you can explore more wonder and learn about Malta's rich history and culture, head to visitmalta.com. Today we're discussing Germany's decision to declare war on the United States in 1941. A grave miscalculation or a necessary escalation? These are questions for our experts, and joining me today, as ever, is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and for the first time on the channel, Dr. Klaus Schmider, senior lecturer at the Royal Military Academy and author of Hitler's Fatal Miscalculation, Why Germany Declared War on the United States. Welcome to you both. We have in front of us here a big map of the alliances of the Second World War around the time that the US entered in December 1941. Dr. Chris Parry, welcome back. Always a pleasure to have you with me. Just sum up the state of the war at the point of US entry in December of 1941.
So I think at this stage we have Germany dominating the continent of Europe. They pushed ahead with Barbarossa from June 1941. They basically have got three main axes. One is going up towards Leningrad, the other to the south towards Ukraine, the other reaching forward to Moscow. And what you've got is a sort of crescent shape in terms of the German attack, basically trying to encircle Moscow. And they think they're up against fewer troops than they are. They don't really understand how many Soviet troops are ahead of them. Most of the world, as you can see, consisting of the British Empire, United States, the dominions of Canada, Australia, and all the other areas of the continent of Asia in blue, are part of the colonial empires. As you can see, you've got China being attacked by Japan even before the attack on Pearl Harbour. Manchuria is the main area there. And you have a situation where Japan has made the decision, instead of attacking the Soviet Union, which is one of the options it could do, instead of consolidating its hold on China, has decided to take on the colonial empires of the Netherlands, France, and indeed Britain in the Pacific. Meanwhile, the winter's setting in, that's the point, and the Germans have not really prepared for that winter. And you see basically huge collections of winter clothing going on in Germany at the time, not actually making it to the front, and quite a lot of the engineering problems associated with operating in minus centigrade conditions are starting to manifest themselves. Machine guns don't work, for example, when they're out in the open. So you've got a bit of a problem going on there. The Americans not really ready for war totally. And in fact, Roosevelt has spent a lot of time stalling the point at which America enters the war until they're ready. They don't have a two-ocean navy yet, which is what they put into their estimates for 1940. They're not fully mobilized. They have a tiny Army Air Force at this stage, and the army is about the size of what Belgium's was before the start of the Second World War. So not really prepared for war, but they're mobilizing very fast indeed, obviously as a result of Pearl Harbour and the events that then follow upon that.
Klaus, welcome to History Undone, first of all. Great to have you on the channel. Do you want to talk us through the sequencing of the US getting involved in the war? Because it all happens quite quickly. Pearl Harbour happens on the 7th of December in US time. And then just talk us through the sequencing of the next few days.
Well, it is a surprise to the Germans, and it's not. I mean, the Japanese have made it abundantly clear to them that they're going to make a big move in the Pacific and that it will almost certainly involve the Americans. But they haven't told them exactly when and how. And crucially, there's not been a hint of something as daring and reckless as the Pearl Harbor strike. Also, the Germans have months and months and months behind them of empty Japanese promises, which broadly hinted at we will essentially blackmail the British, we will even attack the Dutch East Indies, we will confront the Americans. The Germans have heard it all before. I mean, the culmination of this was a visit by the Japanese military attaché in Berlin to Army High Command in Zossen, where he went into the most astonishing detail about how and when they would actually fan out from Manchuria and attack the Russian Far East. This was not just a vague, well, we may or we may not. It was incredibly specific. And the German minutes of this interview are festooned with oversized exclamation and question marks, as in, is this really happening? Then, of course, it didn't. And this is down to the unique, you could say, character of, you could say, the Japanese leadership clique, where everybody is constantly at odds with each other and at cross purposes even. So when this finally does happen, the Germans are completely blown away. Essentially, they knew something was coming, but they couldn't quite bring themselves to believe it. And then they were convinced, and that's the other thing we need to keep in mind, that's going to play a role even in the days around 11th December, that, and this is the part we struggle with, that maybe, just maybe, in light of the spectacular Japanese victories of the first few days of their blitzkrieg, maybe the Western powers would do a Far Eastern Munich. That is a genuine fear on the German side, even beyond December 11th. As in, okay, the Brits and the Americans have just taken a horrible beating. Nobody saw this coming. So maybe they'll just gift Tokyo, I don't know, half the Dutch East Indies, and then they'll kiss and make up. For about a week or so, that is a genuine fear in Berlin. And that is going to explain why everybody in Germany is in such a haste to essentially deliver on this promised declaration of war. They want to seal the deal, and they want to give visible support to the warmongers in Tokyo, because they know that there is a faction in Japan which isn't quite happy with this idea of going to war with, well, half the world, really. They still have some misgivings.
Chris, from your reading of it, give us a sense of the dynamics within the Tripartite Pact at this point.
Well, we've got to remember the Tripartite Pact, that dates from 1940, is basically a defensive alliance saying, look, if another party intervenes, in square brackets, the United States, we'll support each other in terms of war-fighting capacity and declaring war and things like that. What it doesn't cover, actually, is this offensive issue by the Japanese. So if one of us attacks the United States, the others aren't actually committed to coming in. But as Klaus said just now, in the 2 weeks before Pearl Harbor, the Germans are giving the Japanese real assurance that if they act in the Pacific, then they're going to be fully supported. There's no question about that. And the Japanese keep coming back and saying, you're sure about that? We'd like that in writing. And the Germans don't give it in writing. But Ribbentrop in particular says, look, we're with you. You know, whatever happens.
But why would you make that assurance? Because presumably that is almost encouraging Japan to strike the US.
Well, because we've got to understand at this time that there's a phony undeclared war going on in the Atlantic between the United States and Germany. And we can come on to the detail of that. And anything that distracts the United States away from the Atlantic and supporting Britain, this is the key point. Remember that Germany is trying to grind down Britain. It's not just Barbarossa going on at this point. Barbarossa is there to try and convince Britain that it needs to surrender or it needs to actually come to terms. So there is a link with the Atlantic here. Now, when the Americans were trying to come to terms with the Japanese in the build-up to Pearl Harbour, the Germans were constantly, diplomatically, in intelligence terms, kind of trying to sabotage those talks. So they want the Japanese really to be this distraction that keeps the Americans focused on the Pacific. And of course, eventually, that's what the Japanese decide. They don't want to go for China. They don't want to take on the Soviet Union again, even though that's going to help Barbarossa. And one of the big disappointments, of course, after Pearl Harbour is that when the Germans declare war on the Americans, that the Japanese don't declare war on the Soviets. Real gap in the sort of thinking there. And so for the Germans, this is great because it's going to keep the Americans off the chessboard for a long while. And Hitler said on a number of occasions before, look, we've probably got 1942 to deal with the Americans. They're going to come in at some stage. And if it's going to be now, it's going to be now. It gives us 1942 before they can mobilise. And we've got to remember that there's this idea from World War I that the Germans were defeated by the stab in the back. It was the home front that collapsed. It wasn't the entry of the Americans into the war that really defeated us. And there's a lot of talk, you can see it in a lot of the literature at the time, is the Americans at the moment don't really count. And until they do count, we don't need to worry about them. But we've got 1942 to deal with this problem in the Atlantic and to stop them supporting Britain and the Soviet Union with Lend-Lease, in a nutshell.
Well, talking of Lend-Lease, is it almost too simplistic, Klaus, to see it as, well, on the 6th of December, the US is neutral, on the 7th or the 8th of December when they declare war on Japan, suddenly they're in the war, whereas in reality, Lend-Lease is passed in the spring of 1941, then it's extended to the USSR in the autumn, and of course they've abandoned key planks of the Neutrality Act as well. So they are very much moving towards entering the war.
I would say that the latter point is the more important of the two. And because Lend-Lease is, you could say, a byword, even somebody with even the most superficial interest in modern history will associate something with Lend-Lease. You could say it's become an iconic term of 20th century history. The dismantling of the neutrality legislation, which mostly concerned the question of American merchantmen taking American weapons and munitions to Britain and other places, that is something the Germans were watching very, very carefully. And Hitler in particular, we have him on record on this issue, as far back as 1939, saw this as the ultimate tripwire. If the Americans should ever completely abolish this, or basically, which is what happened, leave it standing as a hollow shell, it was never formally abolished, that basically means that we can count on these guys jumping us in the next 4, 5, maybe 6 months. Yeah. And as late as 13th, 14th November, when the Japanese make their first serious approach to the embassy in Tokyo, the German reaction is, well, we'd rather you didn't go to war with the US. That's something which barely pops up in historiography, which I find astonishing. Here you've got characters like essentially Ribbentrop and Hitler cast in the unlikely role of trying to de-escalate a raging war. They actually say, no, whatever you do, don't do anything rash, and crucially, we would much prefer you left the Americans out of it. And that changes 5 days later. when the neutrality legislation is finally dismantled, or rather the deal is sealed by both houses of Congress. Only then do the Germans get the idea that, okay, we're off to the races. Whatever it is, whatever lunacy the Japanese are cooking up, maybe we should get on board. Not before.
Okay, so that's the context for what is happening around December 1941. Now let's get into the real reason that Hitler declared war on the US. Okay, let's just run through some of the key statistics of what US entry into Europe and the wider war meant. By 1944, the US was sending around 250,000 troops a month to Europe, meaning that by the end of the war, approximately 3 million US military personnel were stationed on the continent across land, sea and air. Of the total 407,316 deaths the US suffered in the war, around 250,000 died in the European theatre, compared to around 160,000 who died in the Pacific. Approximately 400,000 additional troops were wounded in Europe. Now, Klaus, we have a new map in front of us. This, we should say, is a map from your book, and it shows the Eastern Front and, crucially, the winter offensive in sort of late 1941 into early 1942. And this really is at the centre of the argument you make in your book as to why Hitler made, as you put it, that fatal miscalculation of declaring the war on the US. Do you want to talk us through your theory, which is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that basically he hadn't fully appreciated the trouble Germany was in on the Eastern Front at the time he declares war?
Well, basically the Germans in mid-November essentially decide we'll have a go at reaching Moscow, because they scored a spectacular victory just to the southwest of Moscow in the first half of October. And 54 Soviet divisions were wiped out. I mean, these were absolutely staggering losses. And it's important to keep in mind that, yes, the Soviet Union of the time was a populous country, but it's not like demographically, it was like 5 or 10 times the size of Germany. It was barely twice the size. So coming on top of other losses, we are really looking at essentially defeats that by any normal standard should be war terminating. And then a curious situation arises where, frankly, Hitler isn't all that keen to make essentially that final leap on Moscow. He feels it's not necessary, that there are other priorities, that winter is coming, and he would much rather tell all 3 army groups to basically pull back a bit and essentially get ready for winter. And it's Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief of the army, and his chief of staff, Franz Halder, who basically engage in a proper sales pitch, both with Hitler and some of the army commanders in the East. Like, we've got to do this, we've got to do this, we've got to do this. And whenever they're told, our logistics are shot to pieces, we haven't got a prayer of pulling this off, not unless the Russians more or less disintegrate in front of us. We really, really don't know about this. And then on November 13th, Franz Halder meets the chiefs of staffs of all army and army group commands at a place called Orsha, which isn't on this map. It's a bit to the west of Smolensk. And they have, you could say, they have a long day chewing over options. Crucially, 3 chiefs of staff from 3 army commands have been excluded. And until now, nobody has remarked on this, or at least it was just felt that maybe they had a busy social calendar. Who knows? But I've discovered enough evidence to suggest that the headquarters of these 3 commands were, shall we say, had the strongest skeptics about the idea of a late autumn campaign. So I'm convinced that Franz Halder excluded them deliberately in order to load the dice, in order to make sure the debate would go his way. So basically what they decide on is a campaign plan for late autumn, which is a lot less ambitious than Franz Halder's original fanciful ideas, which involved 1 German army command to make a leap all the way to Gorky, which is halfway to the Urals. Instead, all the army commands of Army Group Center are going to stay close together and focus on getting to Moscow. That's going to be the mission, okay? No, essentially, you can say mad drives to places like Stalingrad and Gorky. Everybody will essentially just stay closely bunched together and see if they can make it to Moscow. There are a couple of weak sisters here. There's, for instance, Günther von Kluge, who is in charge of 4th Army, who will essentially be in charge here of the center, who is not that convinced. He's basically saying, well, maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. Are you sure about this? So, mind you, Günther von Kluge is somebody who's going to gain a reputation for keeping his options open. Never saying no, but not committing either. That's essentially how he's going to make his career. And this is basically a very, very good example of this happening. The offensive kicks off on November 15th, but it does so gradually. Every corps just peels off and wanders off into the Russian horizon, you could say, as their fuel situation allows. That's the most amazing thing. I mean, not one of these formations is actually good and ready to go. They just feel that this is a window of opportunity which shouldn't be missed because the winter's coming, the Russians are reinforcing, and crucially, the Luftwaffe is decamping for the Mediterranean, which in itself is an interesting indicator. If Adolf Hitler had any serious interest in prioritizing Moscow, if to him this had been the do or die moment of the war, as many historians have implied, then he would have resourced this differently. For one thing, he would have told Luftflotte 2, no, I'm sorry about the rubbish weather, but you're staying in Russia because I'm going to need you there, and I'm sorry the Italians will have to fend for themselves. Nothing of the kind happened. He is actually not particularly happy. So the German offensive progresses, makes some, don't get me wrong, there's some serious real estate that is acquired. A fair number of Russian prisoners taken along the way, but on December 3rd, 4th, it dies. And on December 5th, the formal order goes out to stop it. Then, of course, what do we do? Where do we go from here? And the thing is, you have ended up in, you could say, a meandering front line, which frankly is impossible to defend.
And this black line here, this is the front line on the 5th of December.
Yeah, exactly. That's the one on the 5th of December, and everybody, for once they're all in agreement that it won't be possible to defend the line there over winter. So, by December 8th, the decision is taken to pull back to this line here. And that means, just so we're clear on this, abandoning every single square mile taken since November 15th and a little bit of extra as well. And this is essentially from the dictator who would make a reputation of never, 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 ever sanctioning retreats. This is quite a substantial retreat, and it's, at least in part, it can be explained by the fact that he was never that committed to the Moscow operation.
That's right.
I mean, he had to be strong-armed into it, and by the time the decision is made, he's quite philosophical about essentially giving up all this chunk of territory, because he feels, well, at least this is going to be a line that is defensible. And that is the state of play on December 8th, 1941.
And so do you think, Klaus, had Pearl Harbour happened, say, a week later, by which time Hitler may have known a lot more about the Russian winter offensive, he would have made a very different decision when it comes to declaring war on the US?
My money is on a clear yes. My money is on a clear yes, because the crucial thing we have to understand is that this particular decision, if you look at the state of play, the information before the German leadership on the morning of December 11th, and the American ambassador is handed a copy of the declaration of war in the German Foreign Office. What does this mean? It basically means that, as far as you can tell, if you freeze the image at that moment in time, the overall strategic situation for Germany, while not brilliant, is, as I would say, good enough for government work. Basically, Bomber Command's offensive has been checked. They've just suffered a major defeat over Berlin, one that is largely forgotten in history. Everybody knows about Nuremberg in 44. Nobody's heard of Berlin in November 41. The introduction of the new Würzburg centimetric radar is going to essentially facilitate further setbacks of this kind. You have got a good situation in the U-boat war because the shipyards are finally turning out enough attack boats. Prior to that, every other sub went to the Baltic to essentially strengthen the training flotillas, because the U-boat arm was basically engaged in an exponential growth process. But now, finally, by the end of the year, they're going to have more than 100 attack subs. That's something they've been trying to get for over 2 years. Now, finally, that aim is in sight. You have the Japanese finally committing to something. And overall, the situation in Russia, while not brilliant, is stable. You can look back on 6 months of, you could say, back-to-back victories over the Red Army on a truly unprecedented scale. And no, you didn't quite make it to Moscow, but you made it to the Donbass, which is one of the key industrial centers of the Russia of the 1940s. And that is more, in fact, probably more important once you've resigned yourself to the fact that the war will drag on into 1942. So there is, if you had asked Adolf Hitler on the morning of December 11th, 1941, "Sir, do you really want to drag another great power into this war? What about the crisis?" He would have said, "Crises? What crises?"
Well, Chris, let's bring you in on that. What do you make of that supposition? Do you think Hitler underestimated the difficulty he was in on the Eastern Front?
Well, he may or may not have done. In terms of my perspective on some of the documents and the sources, is I'm not sure that the German High Command really knew what was going on in detail, not just here, but outside Leningrad and also down in the south as well. And it took, as Klaus says, it took a real long time. The other thing is Hitler's not in Berlin. He's actually visiting the front line during this period. And quite a lot of the major players are not in the same place. So it's quite interesting. You read in Goebbels' diaries, for example, that one of the reasons that Hitler was keen to declare war is that great countries don't get declared war on. And there's this reflection back in 1939 that Britain and France declared war on us. That's not what great countries do. That's the first thing. There's another thing. Just after Pearl Harbour, Roosevelt talks to the American people. And he says, of course, this is not just about Japan. It's about Germany and Italy as well. They're in a global conspiracy to suppress free people. And this is brought back to Goebbels. It's brought back to everybody in the Nazi high command that actually we're being roped in here with the Japanese. And it's quite clear that the Americans see this as a global war against all three opponents. So I doubt whether the Germans actually had a choice about declaring war. What is also interesting is the year before, if you look at some recordings that were made with Roosevelt talking to his Democratic supporters ahead of the election, he actually said, it's okay if people declare war on us, we'll choose whether we go back and fight them. And in fact, what's intriguing is if you look at some of Germany's allies, when Germany declares war with them, so Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, the Americans actually take 6 months to actually react and say, if you don't attack us, we're not going to attack you. And so the American position is quite interesting in that respect. Now, my own view, and it comes obviously from reading other sources, is that the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, has been dying to get hold of the Americans since 1939. They believe, headed by Grand Admiral Raeder, that if you destroy all shipping in the Atlantic, then everything's cut off to Britain and it solves the problem, the reason why you invaded Russia in the first place, to actually get Britain out of the war. And they chirp up again. They say, look, this is our opportunity to actually take on the Americans, sink everything that's coming our way. Oh, and by the way, for the last 3 months, we've been in a state of undeclared war. we've actually sunk an American destroyer. American destroyers are hunting and shooting on sight our U-boats. Just last month, they captured one of our blockade runners off Brazil. It is quite clear the Americans are already at war with us. And American admirals are saying in private correspondence, of course we're at war with Germany already. They call it belligerent neutrality, but of course they've extended their neutrality and protection zones progressively to the east from 60 degrees longitude to 26. They're supporting convoys all the way across the Atlantic on the pretext of protecting American goods under Lend-Lease and the supplies to Iceland and Greenland. The fact of life is there is a real problem. And one of the things, I know Klaus knows this, the declaration of war by Germany that is delivered by Ribbentrop to the American Chargé d'Affaires is all about the naval war. It is all about the fact that blockade runners have been intercepted. It's about U-boats being attacked in the North Atlantic. And we know behind this that Hitler knew at some stage he would have to take on America. He wanted to do it later, of course. That's what Plan Z, the German Navy plan, was designed to deal with. That's what bases on the North African coast, potentially in Spain, certainly in Norway, Trondheim around there, were designed to deal with. And specifically, Hitler says, we've got a window of opportunity in 1942 to take on the Americans before they mobilise, before they can get across and sort us out. And in the meantime, we can strangle Britain. And I believe that is the real strategic advantage, just picking up the pieces that occur here. I mean, I take Klaus's point that they feel complacent about what's going on here in Russia, but they don't rate the Americans either. That's the point. There are frequent references from the First World War. Well, the Americans didn't make much difference, really. It was the home front that collapsed on us that took this here. But the key thing is that there's a timing issue here. I need to get back to Berlin. I need to talk to the Reichstag. I need to declare war on America. I don't want them declaring war on us. And I think the Roosevelt fireside chat tells Germany, we're after you now. And I think they want to...
So you think Hitler thinks that Roosevelt is going to declare war on him anyway? He's
going to start conducting real operations, that's right. Because he specifically says it's not just about Japan. It's about Germany. And they also know, of course, they don't know specifically about the Germany first aspects of the Atlantic Charter, but they know pretty much from intelligence that Germany is in the frame here. There's no question about that. And in September 1941, 72% in a Gallup poll think that America should go to war with Germany because of what's happening in Europe. So it's building. The isolationist pressure is not there anymore. Roosevelt knows that they're not ready in terms of armaments and in terms of mobilization. He's trying to hold it off as long as possible. But I think he sees a critical point arriving there, that if we're going to go to war with Japan, we might as well take on Germany as well. That message gets across. And as I said, I think Hitler and Goebbels between them say, we want to declare war on you. You're not declaring war on us.
Klaus, let's bring you back in on that. I mean, I suppose two things can be true at once, can they not? That
True.
Yeah.
On the one hand, Hitler may have completely underestimated the trouble he's in on the Eastern Front, but also thinks, well, it wouldn't be the worst thing if we can launch unrestricted U-boat warfare against the Americans in the Atlantic.
That's true, but that presupposes that at any point in 1941, he considered unrestricted commerce warfare as a key pillar of German strategy against the Western powers. And there isn't. I mean, by and large, the evidence indicates that he's willing to compromise there. He is willing to essentially actually put the U-boats on a leash, as he did on a number of occasions, as in, please don't engage this sort of vessel, please don't essentially go beyond X. And if you essentially have a non-illuminated naval vessel in your crosshairs, please don't blow it away. It might just be American, and I don't want that right now. And granted, all of this has more or less vanished by October, November. Yeah. And essentially, he's basically told the U-boats, yeah, sure, if you find something that looks like it's worth sinking, sink it. But at the same time, the U-boat arm has adopted an attitude of, sure enough, if the Americans want to come over, we'll just engage them and sink them. It's no longer a case of, my God, we're being backed into a corner, and if we want to get out of it, we can only do so by declaring war on the US. It no longer works that way, not by autumn. By autumn, both sides have reached a point, not exactly by mutual consent, but they have just arrived there, that essentially, yes, the Americans are going to send over destroyers and oilers to Iceland to support them. And whenever a U-boat chances upon one of those, it will just torpedo it.
And it does. The Reuben James is actually torpedoed.
And the USS Caesar, a few hours prior to the Reuben James. The thing is that on neither side is there the expectation that any of these incidents will result in a declaration of war. You've just got yourself a shooting war.
And very briefly, I want to put this to each of you before we move on to what the consequences would have been had Hitler not declared war on the US when he did. Is there any truth in your view in this theory? You often hear that basically this was just an act of Hitler's madness, that he thought, let's just have all-out war then, and in a kind of fit of pique declared war on the US. Is there any truth in that, in your view, Chris?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you know, I've read reports, you know, from diaries and things saying that actually Hitler cracked out the champagne. Because you had an undeclared war that suddenly became a war that Goebbels says in his diaries there was a huge psychological relief when this happened, because we knew the Americans were helping the British and the Soviets. We now knew the enemy that we had to face. So there's all of this. And the other critical thing is, apart from the German ambassador to Washington, there is universal approval in Germany for this, even before the Reichstag speech, which Hitler makes. You just read in all the literature, great, we knew it was coming, we've now got it, let's get on with it. And as I said, I don't think that Hitler rated the Americans for about a year. He looked at what happened in World War I in terms of mobilization, in terms of training and things like that. And I take Klaus's point, you know, why go for marginal benefits in the Atlantic when you saw the result of that in World War I, which was a real learning exercise for the Germans. But he doesn't rate the Americans for about a year. And if he thinks he can basically deal with the East and the Americans at the same time, then he wins quite a lot. In fact, Grand Admiral Raeder very quickly comes out with a pre-prepared plan where he says, look, go on the defensive in Russia. What we can do is tie up the Atlantic, and with the Japanese, the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Italians, the Mediterranean. Let's go for that. He actually comes out straight away as soon as Pearl Harbour is attacked. And
Klaus, just briefly, that point to you. You say that it was a fatal miscalculation by Hitler. What's your response to those who say it's an example of Hitler's insanity?
I'd say we're looking at two different problems here. And people for essentially 80 years have struggled to keep them separated. Adolf Hitler had this idea that Germany had to be the next superpower. I mean, don't get me wrong, the term superpower had not yet been coined at the time.
Hyperpower even.
Yeah, it's essentially, that's a post-war creation, but I'm going to adopt it anyway. He saw Germany as the up-and-coming superpower. There wasn't like a middle road. It's not like Germany could or should have essentially resigned herself to be some sort of regional power, which by the late 1930s would actually be an ideal fit in a number of ways. No, Germany had to be a superpower, and that, of course, also entailed seizing large parts of the Western territories of the USSR and essentially engaging in serious ethnic cleansing to make room for German settlers. Now, if you take a step back and take in this scenario, then you can clearly state, yeah, somebody's out to lunch here. The thing is that working off that scenario, which I grant you is nuts, the declaration of war on the US does make sense.
Yeah.
However, I don't think it would have happened a week later.
Well, that is fascinating. This has been fascinating. We've discussed the real history of Hitler's decision to declare war on the US. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. Okay, well, this is what we love doing here on History Undone. Time to ask ourselves some of the long-term questions. Had Hitler not declared war on the US in December 1941? Chris, to start with you, I suppose the big one is, could Britain and the Soviet Union have won the war on their own without the US?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, one of the ironies of this situation is that one of the reasons, of course, Hitler turns east is to discourage Britain from carrying on. And in some ways, declaring war on the United States and really going for it in the Atlantic could knock Britain out. So that's a real incentive, actually, to go for this. Now, could Britain and the Soviet Union have continued? I think yes, given the fact that the Americans would still be the arsenal of democracy. And if they were able to supply Britain and continue with what they were doing in the Atlantic and supply the Russians, not just this way, but also this way as well. Because remember, one of the key ironies here is that Japan doesn't follow suit and declare war on the Soviet Union, as the Germans would have dearly liked.
And you would have thought that Germany would have some kind of agreement with Japan of, OK, well, if we're going to declare war on the US because you're at war with them in the Pacific, please can you help us with the Soviets?
And there is definite disappointment that this doesn't happen. And throughout the war, what we've got to remember is right to within 2 weeks of the end of the war, American aid was coming into the Soviet Union right under the eyes of the Japanese. Quite extraordinary situation that you have here. And so I think what would have happened is that America would have used Britain and the Soviet Union as proxies to actually fight the war they wanted to fight if they hadn't been declared war against. However, having said that, I mentioned earlier that Roosevelt gave this fireside chat. I think America would have been committed to war against Italy, Japan and Germany, regardless of whether Hitler had declared war. It just would have escalated, I think, and the Americans simply would have come in at a time and place of their choosing. And one of the reasons I think Hitler chose to go when he did, it was a time and place of his choosing, not the Americans. And I think that in my mind, if you think how he's thought in other areas, that is what he was thinking at the time. Much rather go now than when the Americans are actually committed. That fireside chat, to me, is absolutely critical because it says to the Germans, you're in the same frame as the Japanese here.
Klaus, I want to bring you in on that. Do you agree that had Hitler, for whatever reason, decided in December 1941 after Pearl Harbour, you know what, it's not in our interest to declare war in the US, that the US would at some point declare war on Germany anyway?
Well, it could. We can get to that situation if, shall we say, the Russian winter offensive outside Moscow, rather than evolving very gradually, as it did, is unleashed all in one day. Then yes, all of a sudden you get alarm bells going off in Berlin, not around the 14th or 15th of December, but a week earlier. Because all of a sudden, essentially, Halder and Bock and Kluge have to own up that the cupboard is bare and they're in a serious crisis. So, yeah, essentially, it all comes down to this one decision, very untypical Soviet decision, not to throw everything and the kitchen sink at the enemy, but to a series of careful probing attacks first. And it's in this way that you could say nearly a week goes by. And only then do they unleash their total offensive, which essentially brings the Germans to the brink of crises. But by that time, it is, of course, too late. In a situation like that, I can imagine, yes, essentially Adolf Hitler telling his foreign secretary to essentially send an email to the Japanese embassy to apprise them of the fact, just had a change of heart, looks like you'll be on your own. Big hug. Lots of luck.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't put it past him at all. I mean, this is...
Well, he's not afraid to sell out his allies, is he?
He's more than happy to sell out anybody.
Yeah.
There's one snag in this, of course, is that Hitler has said to Mussolini, don't announce before I announce that I'm declared war. Italy's always declared war. He actually gets up 2 hours before Hitler and declares war on both their behalves. So it's a slight typical Mussolini, of course, trying to get the glory. But the fact is, once Pearl Harbour's happened, there is the United States is committed. And just after, I said earlier on that 72% in a Gallup poll in September 41 wanted to go to war with Germany. It's 90% after the fireside chat by Roosevelt. And so the isolationist lobbies have been completely defeated in that respect. And there's this dynamic in the States. I put it absolutely down to this fireside chat that he is able to convince Congress. That's the first thing, and also the American people that they're going to go to war anyway.
But without the declaration by Hitler of war against the US, does it change the approach that the US have? Does it make Pacific first more likely if you haven't had that declaration by Hitler?
No, it doesn't, because you've had the Atlantic Charter, you've had all the discussions between the combined chiefs of staff. It's Germany first. And this has taken place well before America enters the war. And so you always go for your strongest opponent. Certainly America's got a problem in the Pacific. They're being rocked back, of course, after Pearl Harbour. They've only got 3 carriers operating. They do the Doolittle raid, remember? So they start punching out, and then we see Midway, we see the Coral Sea, we see Midway, and then Guadalcanal. So there's an idea that they can cope. So in some ways, it's a reverse of what Raeder is offering Hitler. So they sort of go on the defensive until they're ready to go on the offensive in the Pacific. But in the meantime, they're starting to concentrate on Germany. And all their training, all their manufactures, all their shipping is actually geared towards that. And what reinforces that, of course, is the fact that a week after the declaration of war, you have Operation Drumbeat. And you have the Type 9 U-boats sent to the west coast of the United States, and they start thinking everything. And so if the Americans weren't committed before to Germany, they're committed to the Atlantic and Germany at that point.
Klaus, I mean, your book is called Hitler's Fatal Miscalculation. Does that not suggest that you see this as the moment, maybe, when Hitler loses the Second World War?
At the very least, he could have bought himself 1 extra year.
Yeah, I agree.
Because it's reasonable to assume in our alternate timeline that at least the first 6 months of the war in the Pacific here would have essentially transpired pretty much as they did in the real timeline. You would have seen a rash of humiliating setbacks and defeats for the Western powers at the hands of an Asian nation. Now, that is going to have a major domestic impact over here. And if, from that point onwards, I mean, you can take that to the bank. An American government, even for the most sensible strategic rationale, tries to essentially get some aid of any shape or form to Britain and the USSR, there will be questions asked in Congress, there will be withering newspaper articles, there will even be crowds in the streets. Before you know it, you will have a divided American war effort. It's what we tend to forget, is that Americans aren't always as united as we imagined them to be up until the early 2000s. 1812, the 1846 war against Britain and Mexico, they saw huge divisions in American society. And even though militarily it makes plenty of sense to go on shipping munitions and weapons, even volunteers like pilots, to the British, because in a theater of war like New Guinea, you will never be able to logistically support more than 3 divisions in theater. So whatever else you've got sitting in dockhouses can be essentially deployed elsewhere. But this would have been guaranteed to become a hugely divisive issue. You would have had literally investigative reporters crawling all over the New York docks to record the number of munitions shipments that went to Britain the week before last. And why wasn't this recorded, Mr. President? Why isn't that stuff on the way to the Pacific to aid our embattled boys? Well, for the very simple reason that they already have enough of the stuff, and that sending them even more isn't going to help anybody, because you can't deploy more than 3 divisions in a theater like New Guinea. But that's not something that is going to wash with Joe Public. It would have, it's practically guaranteed, to become a hugely divisive issue. Why are we carrying on with Lend-Lease if the Japanese are giving us one hiding after another in the South Pacific?
Chris, let's get your thoughts on that. I mean, that sounds to me as if there is a scenario in which the US don't get involved in the war in Europe because they are so focused, understandably, on protecting their interests in the Pacific.
If they can hold the line between Australia and Hawaii, they're happy initially. Admiral King isn't happy because he's really aggressive and offensive.
Oh, he's never happy.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yes. In fact, his daughter famously said he's very even-tempered. He's always in a rage. But the fact of life is they are committed to a combined strategy. My sense here from Berlin is if we can get Britain knocked out here by isolating it and really conduct, and as Klaus says, the amount of U-boat production is going up significantly. I think they're producing 15 a month by the end of 1941. In fact, by mid-1941, the Germans are producing 15 a month, and they're deploying in ever-increasing numbers. And I think there's a real incentive to knock Britain out at this point. Now, if you knock Britain out, what's America going to do to you? Because actually, that aircraft carrier that's unsinkable, that base for actually coming back into Europe, disappears. If you're knocked out, you come to terms, or indeed you're defeated because you've been starved into surrender. Again, I think this year gap that Hitler has in his mind is absolutely critical as to why they have to declare war as early as possible. Let's get on with it. If you can hold the line, I mean, I take the point. If you lose Midway, if you lose the Coral Sea, then I think you're starting to think it's approaching the West Coast now, it's approaching Hawaii. But as long as the Americans maintain that link, and also protect the West Coast, they say we can go on the offensive any time we've got the resources to do that. We don't have it necessarily now. But the important thing for us now in this global struggle, and this is a key point again about Roosevelt's philosophy, we've got to keep our proxy, Britain, in the war. We've got to keep the Soviet Union in the war as long as we can, because that's how we're going to win this global war, because we're going to defeat the strongest opponent, which is Germany. And that's all the way through the Combined Chiefs of Staff minutes is it's always got to be Germany because the others will fail if we get rid of Germany. Because Italy obviously will fall and Japan is a separate issue. So I think we've got to see this decision from the Americans in particular is they would have come in anyway.
Yeah.
That's the point.
But do you agree with Klaus's point that the timeline looks different? That essentially the Second World War probably gets extended because of this?
I'm not sure. I mean, it's very reductive, isn't it? Whichever way you look at it. And as Klaus says, if the Soviets had attacked in strength around December 1941, you've got a totally different story. So it's quite difficult. All I'm saying is, regardless of whether Hitler was going to declare war on the 11th of December, the Americans were going to. Despite their record of not actually doing that before, that fireside speech gave an indication to the American people of the way forward and very little pushback on that. And as I said, a 90% approval rating for that philosophy. And so if you look at the newspapers at the time, nobody came back at Roosevelt and said, we're not going to do that. We can't see that happening. I take the point. Had it gone wrong, Guadalcanal had failed later on, you're seeing, obviously, but as long as there's no threat to that link to Australia, the ability to come back into the Pacific, as long as the West Coast and Hawaii are safe and we're building up our naval power there, I don't think there's an issue. I think it's down to this ego thing again. Remember this discussion between Goebbels and Hitler about great countries declare war on other people. We're not having people declare war on us.
Well, on the topic of declaring war, maybe a counterfactual we should explore is what if at the same time Hitler gets his way and the Japanese declare war on the Soviet Union? I mean, does that, then that's ever going to happen? No,
it's literally not on the cards. There's even one point where the liaison conference in Tokyo, which is the de facto cabinet, because the cabinet is just there to rubber stamp whatever the liaison conference decides, where very briefly the topic is broached. I couldn't give you the exact date, at some point in October or November. What if the Germans were to send us a clear no? If you make this move, you are going to be on your own. And the consensus is we're doing it anyway.
I mean, what I think is remarkable is that the Japanese aggression against these colonies doesn't happen without the war in Europe.
That's true, definitely.
I mean, it's an absolute sine qua non.
Yeah.
Without France, the Netherlands and Britain being weakened by having to fight Nazi Germany, they're not going to do this. They're going to probably go to China and say, we'll finish off China. The other thing is, people forget, is the Soviets gave the Japanese a good hiding in 1939. They had a little brush then at the top of Manchuria, and the Soviets gave them a serious beating. So they're thinking, we don't really fancy that again, not while we're engaged in China and also while we're thinking about this down here. But again, we've got to see the interrelated elements here. I mean, Japan itself is terrified, actually. It's very, very close to the Soviet Union. And although the Soviet Unions don't have a great amphibious capability, the fact of life is the Japanese feel vulnerable because they're so close geographically to these areas here. So you can see why the Japanese might not want to do that. What is interesting, of course, is we see on the naval side, you get Operation Monsoon, which is where you get U-boats coming down this side of Africa afterwards. They also come into the Indian Ocean, and you see Japanese submarines coming this way as well later in the war. So there is an attempt to join up strategy, but the most remarkable thing about the Tripartite Pact is the real incompetence and ineptitude by which the Japanese-German relationship is run. There's very little coordinated effort in any way. And in fact, the Japanese contribution to World War I on the side of the Allies was a lot more efficient, almost to the point, well, in fact, actually to the point where you had a Japanese squadron in Malta during the First World War. So you see the elements of cooperation. You never saw Japanese warships that far west in the Second World War supporting Germany and Italy, mainly because they were tied up in the Pacific. But my sense is, and I think Klaus is right here, it's not a strategic decision by Germany, it's a tactical decision. Let's knock Britain out early. There's a real chance here. That's why we're stuck here in Russia after all. It's because we wanted to knock Britain out. Knock Britain out, America's not coming for D-Day, is he? That's the other thing.
Let's get some final thoughts from each of you. Klaus, to start with you, how big a turning point, if indeed it was a turning point, do you think Hitler's declaration of war on the US really was?
It's basically, of course, how best to put this? It's the final off-ramp for Nazi Germany. It's the last exit to Brooklyn. Different call, there's still a genuine 50-50 chance. I'm not rating it higher than that, but there's still a 50-50 chance that the Third Reich might just, you could say, survive.
And just talk me through that scenario. How would it survive in that 50-50 scenario?
You just bought yourself at least another year, because I'm sorry, I do not see the Americans intervening in any shape or form in 1942.
And neither did Hitler. That's the point.
Maybe at some point in 1943, and I can think of a possible scenario there. But it gives you extra time to defeat either the UK or the Soviet Union, which is difficult. Either of the two, don't get me wrong, either of the two, even with only some American assistance, is a major challenge. But now you are at a stage where it might just work. Just maybe. And from that point onwards, you can imagine all kinds of things happening. And then, of course, you could argue against that essentially even with, shall we say, the Germans victorious here in the Soviet Union, the British Prime Minister, at some point in the summer of 1945, steps out into the street outside 10 Downing Street, asks the duty bobby about that enormous parcel that has just appeared on his doorstep. And he just gets the answer, well, it's the latest Lend-Lease delivery, sir. And inside is a gift-wrapped Hiroshima-type nuclear bomb. All sorts of goodies, lethal goodies, came via Lend-Lease. There's absolutely nothing in the Lend-Lease law that rules out weapons of mass destruction.
So you could have a scenario in which the bomb is dropped on Berlin?
Yeah. Ideally, right after it's dropped on the Japanese, so that the Germans get an idea of what's headed their way. And then essentially, the Americans just wash their hands of the whole thing, like, oh my God, bomber commanders taking nuclear weapons into the air war? Nothing to do with us. Absolutely nothing to do with us.
Chris, get some final thoughts from you. I mean, it is the kind of catch-22 of all World War II counterfactuals that you get to the bomb eventually. What is your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, they've only got 2 bombs, of course. They're the ones they use at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so they could have one in each continent. You're absolutely right. My sense in all of this is there's a real incentive in 1942 to knock Britain out, and that's by isolating it in the Atlantic before the Americans can come into the war. Hitler himself says it'll be a year before the Americans actually get to grips with us. I think that the Americans are coming for them anyway. And I think, as I said, there are enough indications coming out in that critical 3-day period between the 8th and the 11th, particularly Roosevelt's fireside chat, saying, we're coming for you anyway. So you might as well declare war. And there is the prestige issue. I keep saying it, but it's quite explicit in Goebbels' diaries. We're not having declared war on us, not again. We're a great power, we're doing that. And I think that's the whole tenor of the Reichstag speech that Hitler makes and the declaration of war. But I think, as I said, there were things glistening away in the near about knocking Britain out, and they wanted to basically try and dissuade America from coming onto them, which they were going to do. So whether he declared war or not, to me, is irrelevant.
Well, James, this is absolutely fascinating. We could talk about this for hours. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. But I think we can say there are maybe, well, at least 2 scenarios if Hitler hadn't declared war on the US in December 1941 in the wake of the declaration of war on the Japanese by the US. One is that it provides Hitler with some respite, if he hadn't done it, to potentially knock out either the Soviet Union or Britain from the war, and that the US never get involved directly in the war in Europe, in which case maybe the Third Reich survives, or at the very least survives for longer. There's the other scenario in which the US were bound to get involved in the war in Europe anyway, that was the direction of travel, and it may have been later, but that the US would have intervened, and as a result, maybe the Second World War doesn't play out all that differently. And of course, what then happens with the atomic bombs? Do you end up with a scenario in which at least one of the bombs is dropped on Germany? I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry and Dr. Klaus Schmider for joining me. And of course, thank you to our sponsors, Visit Malta. Remember, if you want to find out how you can explore more wonder and learn about Malta's rich history and culture, head to visitmalta.com. And we'll be back undoing more history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone, on YouTube. And don't forget, you can also listen to the show wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.